I'm Suzanne Silverman, Editorial Director of Commercial Property Executive, and I'm here today with Jeb Belford, Managing Director and CIO of Clarion Partners, Jeff DeBoer, Founding President and CEO of the Real Estate Roundtable, Mark Rose, CEO at Avison Young, and Stacie Trott, Co-Chair of the Global and New York Real Estate Practices at DLA Piper. We're recording this session, and it'll be available for later viewing. In addition, we're going to leave some time at the end to answer your questions, but please feel free to submit them at any time during the webinar. And thank you to those of you who submitted some in advance. We'll try to get to as many as possible. I'd like to start today's discussion by asking each of you what your top expectation is for the second half. And Mark, why don't we start with you?
Absolutely. My expectation is things will start to fall into place. I'm feeling very positive in terms of what the future holds for commercial real estate and all real estate. I do think that we have a habit, whether it's through panels like this or other things, that we read each day, that we try to paint everything with a very, very wide brush. Right now we're still in a cyclical, we're in a cycle, we're at a cyclical trough. It doesn't look like it's going to get any worse. It looks like we are positioned for a recovery. And I would say the main point to get across here, because of the lack of debt still, I do believe that we're going to have to push back some of the expectations for a bigger bounce back into 2025 and potentially into the back half of 2025. Now, I know we did that in 2023 and we were disappointed. I think we're going to be disappointed in 2024, but just understand things have to work through the system. I think the industry is handling this relatively well. I think the banking system is handling this relatively well. So I would expect more of the same. And as this is really, a U.S. audience, as much as we love or kind of would love an interest rate decrease in September, based on the election, we may get something in September, but more likely that we'll get some action after the presidential election. But from there on out, things actually look like they're falling into place to have your incremental, gains. So feeling pretty bright at a period of time where we're all still suffering, kind of bouncing along a bottom.
Okay, thank you. Who has more to add on to that?
I'll just add a couple comments onto that, and we're generally in a total agreement with that outlook. I think a lot of people at the beginning of the year felt like this was going to be the transition year, and that we magically were going to hit a bottom right around now in the middle of the year, and then we'd start a whole bunch of optimism we'd start seeing a pickup of transaction activity and capital flows in the back half of this year. And we would agree that that's getting pushed out. Our expectation is that the rest of this year is going to be slightly down to flattish when it comes to returns. People are going to still have significant questions on where ultimate debt and borrowing rates settle. We've obviously got the election coming. So there's a fair amount of uncertainty still out there, which we would think is still going to make our space slower than we'd like through the balance of this year. And our expectation is that sometime in 25 is really going to be the time when we see things start to pick up again.
I'll just say ditto. I agree with everything that was just said. And it's what you're hearing in the market. It's, we're all at the same things, listening to the same people say the same things. So I would just, piggyback ditto. And I think the big question mark is when in 2025 will we see it? And obviously, if you're super optimistic, we're hoping for the first half of the year, Q1 would be amazing. But if by the end of Q2, we see, a real shift, that will be great. And I think the crystal ball is the question of will it be more in the second half of the year, which will kind of make where we are right now feel like we could be a year out instead of, it's on the more immediate horizon. So I think time will tell. And unfortunately or fortunately, the election is going to play a big role in that here in the U.S. So.
Great. And
yeah,
so,
can I just chime in on
please do.
On one
yes,
thought?
Jeff.
I agree with all of this. It's kind of going through the system. The pig is going through the python, so to speak, and it's a slow process and all of that. And a lot of this has to do with just shifting demand and projecting demand after the pandemic, and how people are going to use the built environment, whether it's housing or shopping or hospitality or even logistics and warehousing and so forth. So all of this is going to work its way through. And I guess as obviously pain out there as the adjustment goes forward. But once we get through this, I just think the industry is well positioned to really be a leader in getting our economy, leading the world again. If maybe we still are, I don't know, but I mean, really getting out there and helping people achieve their goals and their dreams on how they use real estate. There's going to be a lot of stuff that'll be scraped. There's a lot of obsolete buildings out there. It's not just office, but other obsolete buildings. And I just think going forward, again, rough patch, but the roughest of the rough patch, I hope, is behind us, and we're starting to even out a little, I think. And by the way, I'm not so sure how much the election is going to impact things, since it is what I do every day. I mean, I do think that every election causes investors to kind of step back and wait and see what's happening. That's going to be the same as it ever was, as they say. And it may be some additional pressure, but I don't think it's going to be all that much different than any election, where people kind of take a pause, see what's going to happen. And it's the end of the year, and people will be either taking gains or not taking gains, and it'll be the same type of thing, I think. But
yeah, and that's what I really meant by the election coming up, just adding to a little of the uncertainty. It's not so much the long-term uncertainty, but it's really the sort of the short-term uncertainty on top of all sorts of other uncertainties at the moment.
Yeah, and Jeff, do you have a view? We have this tendency to get myopic, as it relates to answering questions. Everybody wants info and act. Do you think it makes sense for the Fed to postpone any action until after the elections, or do you think they could be brave enough if the information underlying the data really underlying inflation, do you think they could act in September?
Yes, they could. I personally don't think they will, though. I think that I don't think they want to pull the trigger too quickly. I think a lot of people accuse them of being too late to the party on raising rates. Probably should have been normalizing them over the last decade. They were too late on that score. And I don't think they want to be too early on thinking that everything is groovy again. So yeah, they could cut rates in September, but I think it much more likely later on. And I think that part of this is just that their data and the way that the Fed measures inflation, particularly on the rental side of things, is catching up. It was wrong for the last year or so, and it's catching up with them now, and the real numbers are coming in. So the real inflation that they're going to be looking at, I think, is more reflective of reality than it was. But I would look for a cut later in the year rather than, in the third quarter. I think the fourth quarter, but anyone's guess. I will say this too. I don't think that the Fed wants to be in a position, and Jay Powell wants to be in a position of being criticized for being political and trying to, goose the economy before the election. I think that, again, that would argue for a more conservative look at where rates are.
That's a really good thought. I want to ask one more broad question about real estate, and then let's really get more into the policy stuff, since that is looming over us right now. And maybe, Jeb, I'll start with you. So what would you consider your biggest concern for real estate, commercial real estate right now?
Well, what I would say is, one thing we really haven't mentioned yet is how different the different property types are performing. So one thing I'm not particularly concerned about, before I get to that, particularly concerned about, is that the fundamentals for a lot of the property types are actually pretty sound, and actually look pretty good going forward, which echoes a couple of sentiments that were already made a few minutes ago, that the industry is poised in general, big picture, reason pretty well going forward once we kind of get through this little squishy period. There's some property types that are not performing terribly well, particularly office. So office, remains a pretty big concern. And we generally have a relatively bearish view on that, which we probably will get into later. But I think if you step back from the fundamentals for a little bit, I think it's if we remain in a really continued uncertain period where people are not willing to commit capital and transactions remain slow, and values don't really move much to the positive. I think that's going to continue to wear on people. So I'm a little worried that like the longer we go here, the more worn out people get. And that'll like hamper a little bit, what you'd think of would be a natural recovery. To me, the really big issue, the $1 million question, is where rates settle, and the difference of opinion on that. So I'm really hopeful that at some time in the next several quarters, we all sort of coalesce to more of a common sentiment of where that ought to end up, and therefore we're more willing to transact. But I think the longer we go with sort of a really uncertain outlook, the worse it is for us.
Stacie, I'm happy to go, but I will defer to the smarter panelist if you want to go first.
No, go ahead, Mark.
I don't have, I don't have one. I've got 10, and I'll try to keep it short, and keep it to 5. Listen, this is an industry that relies on capital, both equity capital and debt capital. The debt capital is not available. The debt capital is not available because you've taken this out of the hands of the banks. And I know that we discussed this, with Jeff in the Real Estate Roundtable. As long as we're being treated the way that we're being treated, which is, you had it great for 10 years at 0 interest rates, and now you just have to deal with it. We're going to struggle. And I do think it's going to get better. I think that people miss, and this is, a little bit of, the soapbox conversation. We have this tendency to want to talk about everything in one global sentence or, a statement or paragraph when, as Jeb said, product by product, city by city, and country by country, different things are happening. But in the United States of America, as it relates to the availability of debt, it is hampered. It's being hampered by not just, the Federal Reserve, who we all agree who were very late, and they probably have gotten this wrong. We completely agree with Jeff. They're using data that is so antiquated and a year old, and inflation probably is much lower than they're actually, reporting. But until rates come down, and then until debt is made available, our industry will struggle. All right. It just can't be where it should be. We can take advantage of the arbitrage between, again, certain product types, certain cities, certain countries. I do see that coming. I think that if you take a look, 10 years ago, we said retail bad, 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 bad. We knocked down C and some B- retail, and the grocery anchored retail center is at the top of the charts of doing well. Malls still need to come back, but it wasn't in our vocabulary to talk about outdoor storage being as hot as can be. We weren't talking about data centers, who clearly have the fundamentals to support it, being great. But again, I think we'll talk about this later. My concerns are that we're not analyzing, we're not discussing the sheer dollar value of office. When you stop trading the biggest dollar value of assets you have in an entire industry, it has an impact on everything else. The perfect example is if you were going to take all the money that you wouldn't spend in office and start to spend it everywhere else, you could create some problems. The good news is that nobody can get debt, so that's really not happening. And real estate in general is not being overbuilt, which is fantastic. But you do have to pay attention to what makes up this industry. and it starts to come together. It starts to loosen up. Office, honestly, the RTO thing is overdone. Inability to get capital to buy, renovate, convert, those are our issues.
So I'll just go next and say, agree. When you say, I'm curious, I have a question as I answer, RTO is overdone, meaning we're saying too much about it, we should stop, it'll naturally happen in its own. When you say overdone, tell me what that means.
I had a conversation while speaking in Davos in January at the World Economic Forum. Somebody who should know, they run one of the top recruiting agencies and temporary staff agencies, when they were throwing out the numbers that we're at 50% of where we were pre-COVID, and said, we have stats and white papers from about the last 4 or 5 decades. The utilization of seats pre-COVID was 40%.
I've heard that too. Yeah, exactly.
Say that again, Mark. The utilization of what?
Seats.
Oh,
Was 40%, because it was part of your compensation, right? To have an office that was your office and you had pictures on the wall and your family, and that's great, but nobody's ever in those seats. If you were client facing, you were out, and
Yep.
These offices have never been full.
At 100%.
Right.
Right.
And if you were a manufacturer, you'd never run a manufacturing plant at 40% utilization, but we effectively ran office there. And I got in trouble with some clients a couple of years ago, but said the return to office issue is a 5-year issue. COVID COVID has been over for 2 years in terms of its major impact. That means we have 3 more years to go. And to back this up, if you look at the tragedy of 9/11, the buildings came down for 2 years. No one wanted to go into Manhattan. Nobody wanted to go into a name building. Nobody wanted to go into a tall building. We spent billions on security, if this sounds really familiar. After 2 years, somebody stepped their toe back in the water, and it got a little better after the 3rd, the 4th, and after the 5th year, most people were back. Is this ever going to be the same as we had it before, with a group of people who are employed who would rather have basically a 3-day work week? Yeah, it's going to be hard to change that, but I'm not sure the utilization is that much different. And the other thing that we're not talking about, there is business formation, there is growth, there is population growth. And we're going to knock down obsolete buildings again, hopefully doing it right so that that we're somewhere near carbon neutral on that. But this is not a dire story. It just feels really, really crummy while it's going on.
100% agree.
Great comments.
Go ahead. Yeah, Jeff, were you going to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say, I was going to thank Suzanne for organizing this kind of thing, because I think it's great to, everybody is in this doom loop mentality. Yes. And I think that they do reject. And when you talk about what you're concerned about, from my point of view, what I'm concerned about is facts. Facts don't seem to be very relevant to conversations anymore. And Mark and Jeb and Stacie have touched on a little bit about, painting all assets with the same brush. That's not true. And all geographies are, it's not true. And the office sector, okay, I get it that there's this remote work, but a lot of the vacancy, now you guys are going to probably object to this, but that's all right. I think a lot of the vacancy is actually, businesses stopped expanding for 4 years or whatever number you want to pick, but the pipeline continued. And so development was going on. And so when you look at these vacancy rates, they're a little misleading, and they're also misleading within the asset class itself on what offices are more vacant than other offices. And it's just facts that bother me, that you just can't really have much of a factual conversation on a lot of things. And the last thing on this point that I'll say is, I've been doing this through, I think, 6 crises now, starting in 1980, and every one, you start hearing people talk about it's the end of the industry. Maybe it's the end of housing investment. In the 90s, we were never going to build another office building again. Remember that? And in the early part of this century, we weren't going to build another mall. We're going to rip them all down, and it's just not true. And the economy will come back, and demographically and growth rates, and it's the greatest country in the world with the best rules for investment in the world. And so optimistic, yeah, and look at the facts, and maybe we can talk about how I think these facts have skewed the whole debate about housing in Washington if you want later on. But I've got my basic point was thanks for having this thing. I love these conversations, and I appreciate it, Suzanne. Thank you.
Well, I'll jump in and take a little bit of the other side of the coin on the office world. And I'll go back to a little bit of the facts comment. Not enough development has occurred to create the vacancy gap that's crept up in the last 4 years. So you can't blame like the increased vacancy on just the fact that people stopped growing and we ended up building some more buildings, and it all of a sudden went from 12 to 20% vacant. And the things that I really look at are, because we actually own a fair amount of office buildings. What are the tenants really doing? What are the tenants really doing when they have to face the decision to either renew or move? And, in our portfolio, and when we talk to all the brokerage firms out there, tenants are taking, on average, 20% less space than they had before. Like, that's a problem. And that's what's created the vacancy. And that pattern has not yet changed. Maybe it will change in the future, but that pattern hasn't changed. And, to me, that's the most depressing fact if you're, or stat when you're looking at the office market. And then when my last comment will be like, when I actually talk to the people out there on our team that are leasing, they're out there leasing the space and all the buildings, other than a couple buildings, and we all know there are some buildings that are actually doing quite well, but other than a couple buildings, there's no good news. There's really no good news on the leasing front out there, when we're talking to ourselves day in and day out. So that leads us respectfully to have a relatively bearish view on where the whole sector's going.
Okay, so so let me jump back in, and it's really not a counter, because I absolutely see your view on that. Just again, facts. So I happen to be in Chicago today, and there's a building near our office that somebody bought very, very well at a very low rate, and they're dropping their rental rates. They did a little bit of a rehab. They're dropping their rental rates, and they're filling it up because they're undercutting the market in a city that is struggling to do leasing. The second thing is, again, this is why you need to dissect some of these. So One Vanderbilt, I think we'll all agree, is a pretty good building, right? It's very well located. So tenants have gone in there and taken 20% less space, but they're paying 3 times the rent. And so what's happening, and Jeb, we work for you as we work for an awful lot of people here. Some of this is decision making in this period of back-to-back black swans. Some of the decision making has shifted from the CEO to the CFO. And maybe this should have happened a long, long time ago. And from my earlier comment, I think we have been using too much space for decades.
Yeah, totally.
But when we say we're using too much space, or that users are taking 20% less, are you talking about what are they cutting from their leases? Are they making the offices smaller? Are they now 125 square feet or 75 square feet? Or are they cutting out the conference rooms and the meeting facilities because people don't go? Or is it a combination of those two things?
Yeah, so let's.
It's everything.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah,
no, go ahead.
No, agreed. Go ahead, Mark. It's everything.
I was gonna ask Stacie. Well, I'm sure in your period of time you had a huge library, right? A law library, and you don't need one of those anymore, right? It's
a library.
Right, exactly. And then in other places, I've walked into some of the top institutions, and we all know them and love their names, that were monuments built to themselves, and they're beautiful with a lot of space that's never going to be used.
Yeah.
And they had it and said, well, we're going to hold client meetings and things of that sort, but then you stop bringing people in because we had COVID. And, you know, you just realize, I mean, I would say 15 years ago, a CFO had brought me into a major insurance company because he was crazed at how much money they spent on occupancy and they didn't need it. And I was brought in to meet the CEO, and I said, right off the bat, we can probably save you multiple hundreds of millions of dollars. And instead, I got chewed out by the CEO because I was set up, who explained to me, son, he called me, do you understand the blankety blank way? Meaning, I want my staff to have wood paneled offices. I want them to be big. Again, it was more of your compensation package as it was, is this a good use of occupancy or space? And I do think in the next 3 years, brand still means something. And the day that CEOs and strategists start to get back to be on par with the CFOs making space decisions, what you look like and what you live in, and from, you know, I don't want to go kind of down this rabbit hole because I do a lot of this work at you know, at WEF, but heritage of buildings, heritage of people, social value, what we need to focus on to have place represent our people and our communities, this is going to change again.
Stacie, what are your
Someone who
thoughts?
still has a landline at home.
What's a landline? I
You know,
rang mine right the other day and scared me. I was like, what is that? No, but so I have a question actually to Mark's comment. You're saying that do you think the CEOs and the CFOs should be making the decisions, or I'm not following? They shouldn't be driving, like costs and savings shouldn't be driving the layout and the way we're thinking about how we use space.
We have shifted to the decisions are about cost. So it's about returns if you're public companies, and even if you're not public companies, returns are critically important. And so taking cost out, absolutely. But at some point, it's like anything else. You can never cut your way in any business to success. And sometimes I think we're going to get back to what you build is going to be meaningful. Again, I want to come back to Chicago right now. You know, South Street is as dead as a doornail. And yet, at one end of LaSalle Street, a Google's headquarters is being built in the downtown. We are all very excited about what this is going to look like and what this means. At the same time, it was a Mayor Lightfoot program, and now, you know, Mayor Johnson has picked up, but there's going to be 3 conversions as well from office to resi. Okay. Brand plays into this. Reestablishing LaSalle Street as a place to be rather than, and this is again fact, these are surveys, that particularly women are scared to walk from the train station to LaSalle Street, which is only 3 blocks. If you can reestablish something, then I think you change the whole tenor. That comes with brand. Brand for a city, brand for a company. There is going to come a point where we get past all of this and profits are up, or people have bailed themselves out of other situations, that I do think you're going to see the elevation back of what businesses mean. But more importantly, I really feel like we're starting to get people to understand, what do communities and place mean to their people? And
that's exciting stuff, Mark. That's exciting stuff for the industry to be helping lead the economy into the new way that it wants to be. I think that's great. And reimagining these buildings that no longer have the purpose that they once had, and so forth. I think it's great. Rough water, sure. But look, when the buggy whip industry went away and the buggy whip manufacturers' buildings were demolished, other buildings were built on top of that land that were more useful and better for the economy as it changed from buggy whip days. So all of this is hard to see when you're in the middle of it, but geez, long term, it just seems to me great stuff for our industry if we do it right, and don't just talk about the good old days, you know, because the good old days were not as great as we all want to pretend. And Anyway,
Yeah, and listen, I want to stop because I think we've taken,
we probably went over.
Suzanne completely off of her schedule here. But
Oh, that's fine.
and I also know that this isn't the housing panel, but I gave a speech, in a panel, Yes in My Backyard, where here's my hope for all the wrong reasons, that we can actually address affordable housing, breaking it between low-income housing and workforce housing. And again, we have, I think, a real issue in this world about we really have to invest and take care of low-income housing. But maybe you want to start that when policemen and firefighters and nurses can't afford their homes in workforce housing, that maybe you should pay attention. Oh, by the way, if that gets you started, shame on you that you haven't addressed low-income housing. But let's get this all started. And Jeff, this comes with a different view to how we're going to solve issues rather than just saying it's capital and returns.
Yeah, well,
which
this
clearly
goes right into my, and Suzanne, we're probably way ahead. Should we kick it back to Suzanne? She's running.
I want to just one more thing.
Every time I run a
office.
meeting and the board goes crazy, I'm like, oh my God, no, we're not.
One more thing about question for Mark about office, and then we should talk policy because I do want to make sure we have time for that. So Mark, you're starting an office fund, right? So clearly you see some opportunity in office. What are you looking for? I mean, talking about all of this future prognostication about how office will be used, how are you looking at it?
Yeah, so
as an investment.
So we've got 5,000 people in the ground, 700 partners, and a lot of other people that own shares in the company, and they come across assets everywhere. Our management folks, our consulting folks, our professional services folks, and yes, our transactional folks. Is this the market for large-scale portfolios of office? No, it's not. Is it for downtown Manhattan going out and buying One Vanderbilt? I'd love to own the building, but buying it now, that's lesser of the opportunity than being able to pick up asset by asset. If you can do it, things that, I'll just give this example, but something that traded for $450 or more a foot, that somebody thinks in this environment they can get $250, and in some cases, given that either their debt's coming up or there could be a host of reasons, including something that's clearly challenging us, which is the cost of insurance to go along with a whole lot of other costs. But a lot of these buildings are running at negative cash flows. There are many of them that are now starting to trade, and I think they're going to be available in the $100 to $150 a foot range, and you can put 100 back in and have something very special. And it's not tomorrow, and it's not whole scale, but you set things up. And I will tell you, I know some of the largest institutional groups are hovering around this as well, but they have to put very large dollars to, at work. I think that there's an opportunity. I also think if you go to Washington, D.C., where Jeff is, I live there. It's been one of the greatest, most stable real estate investment cities of all time. And given what's happened, and again, no political comments, just there's nobody in the city, right? And so they're facing budget deficits, funding deficits. But this is a place that if in the next few years that leadership gets the federal worker back in, you can be all over DC. It's just too good a city not to.
By the way, when you say nobody's here, every parking lot is filled, every restaurant and bar is filled, every sporting event is filled, but the offices aren't. And as far as the federal government coming back to work, in fairness to President Biden, he has made the statements calling them back. And the problem really, and I'm from a union family, don't get me wrong, I'm not a union basher, but these unions within each agency and the workforce just vehemently does not want to come back into the city. These federal workers do not want to be here. And I don't know how that's going to change under any administration, frankly, unfortunately. Sorry, Mark. I hope I didn't blow your
No,
whole.
no. And again, the point was, if there's a mandate, if people come back, it's too great a city.
I think this
Not
will
to be.
change. I think this will change when people realize that they're not getting advancements within their place of employment. They're not learning. And the people who really need this are the people that, you know, I thought in the last 4 or 5 years, we were all supposed to be helping more, you know, whether it's women owned or people of color or veterans or so forth. And they're the ones who really need that mentor, in my view, that mentoring stuff. And they're going to figure out pretty soon that they're getting left behind, and young people who are interning by sitting in their house, and they're interning in jobs and they're not learning. And eventually, I gotta believe, I'm not saying we're going back to the old days of 5 days a week work, but this notion of big remote work in all classes of our employment base, I think will start to erode. And Mark, and you guys are around the world, and it's different around the world in terms of being in a workplace of work and competition. We're going to see it. Anyway, I'm optimistic about this, but DC is in terrible trouble because there aren't workers down here to support the small businesses and the smaller restaurants and those little things. And those people are getting hit pretty hard.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
So let's talk policy for a bit. And Jeff, you made a comment earlier about the predictions that you all were making about real estate being not impacted by the coming election. So does it matter for real estate who ends up in control?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Well, you know, a lot. Yeah, it does matter on the margin, but a lot of these issues that are of concern to us are going to be front and center, regardless of who has the gavel or who's in the White House. Housing is a big problem. It's going to have to be addressed in some way, shape, or form. You know, environmental concerns and energy efficiency, this stuff's not going away. The tax code, basically the entire tax code, is going to be redebated in the next couple of years. We've got a huge debt, an ongoing operating deficit, and a long-term national debt that people want to discuss. And so all of these things are going to be front and center for policymakers, regardless of who's calling the shots. Now, how those issues are presented and lined up and all of that kind of stuff, yeah, it matters, you know, it matters, but it's not always on one side, you know. I mean, it goes back and forth on different things. And so, but the basic stuff that we have to be debating. And by the way, Mark, you mentioned, you know, this is a capital intensive industry, right? Well, historically, the Republican Party has always been the party that promotes capital formation and rewards capital investment. Okay. And that's been the way for decades and decades. Recently, Senator Josh Hawley, Republican, gave a very well covered speech where he said he doesn't understand why capital is rewarded more than labor. And so, you know, we're going to have a lot of these kinds of discussions that go to the very heart of returns on our industry and so forth. And so it does matter, but it doesn't matter. I mean, it's weird. And if you look over the time on economic GDP growth and so forth, there's not a significant, huge difference in whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, shockingly enough. Now, within the GDP numbers, the big picture numbers, yeah, the winners and losers within those categories will change. But the big picture of growth rates and stuff is about the same, oddly enough.
And just to put real estate into this perspective, I'd like to get everybody's perception, because I've heard in our planning calls some of the discussions about how you see Washington as viewing the commercial real estate industry. And Mark and Jeb and Stacie, let's hear from you first, and then we'll hear from Jeff, who's in it all the time.
Well, I don't want to take the oxygen from the room. So do that enough at home and I get complained about. So
well, I'll throw out a question. Is like, does Washington actually really care about us at all? much. So obviously the housing market is of critical concern, but do they really, or are they really worried about the problems that we're facing, or are there so many other bigger fish to fry that, we're a secondary concern?
That's a great question, Jeb. And it's actually when I saw this question in our like list of questions, I had the same feeling like, okay, there's housing. And then we're the ESG environmental kind of component of the pieces that we're talking about, but how much is Washington commenting on our industry specifically beyond the two things that, we just mentioned, which are more how do we affect the national and global issues here in that regard? So I don't know that there is a lot that's necessarily happening that's coming out of Washington. We'll wait for Jeff to respond at the end, but I agree with your question in that if it was a question with a statement included in it, I concur. But maybe Mark has a different view.
Well, first, I'm Jeff DeBoer's, Chamber of Commerce here. I mean, this is why, for those of you who are not part of the Real Estate Roundtable, please go to the website because there's information there. But what Jeff puts together, and again, it's under Chatham House rules and we can't talk about the details, but Jeff, I can clearly tell you that it's not that they don't care about us, but they clearly have deemed us just collateral damage. That in the fight against inflation, we had it really, really, really good for a decade with very low interest rates. I don't like some comments that come out, only rich people have real estate. That's not the case. Real estate drives every single thing that we do. So the Federal Reserve, one can argue, hasn't done a particularly good job. And maybe on another hand, there are parts of it that they have because, they have fought it. Have they moved too quickly or too slowly? Absolutely can argue it. But when it comes to policy right now, I think we're going to be fighting something else. I mean, this is me personally. I'm not going to put it to Real Estate Roundtable. There's going to have to be a TRIA-like insurance policy because insurance is out of control and nobody can afford it. And our industry is going to be in a heap load of trouble if we don't somehow, tackle this issue. I know that Trump's tax cuts are coming up and that will have an impact. There's no doubt that that's going to have an impact on, on our industry, and Jeff and team, they represent us, and, we're counting on them there. And then you have other things in that tax code. I mean, kind of 1031s and carried interest. These are these are really major issues that, that I know the Real Estate Roundtable and others are all working on and thinking about. But Suzanne, I got to tell you something. I think we're going into the next year to 18 months of things that can have a fairly significant impact on our industry. So,
Okay, Jeff?
Well, having done this in Washington, as you know, Suzanne, for 43 years, I can tell you that the view, and I strongly believe this, the view in Washington of the real estate industry is light years better than it was 40 years, light years. And I would also say that I would like to know what national policy applying to real estate you want changed. All of the things that Mark just mentioned are things that we've either secured in law or have been defending for decades. And so I'm not sure what it is that people think that Washington is doing to them in the real estate industry, because I'm not aware of what that is. I know about speeches and I know about bills that are introduced. I'm talking about actual laws that are enacted. Now, there are regulations that we can quibble about, but big picture laws. And I think the reason for that is that we have changed the narrative in the last certainly 25 years away from what Mark mentioned about just being rich people in real estate and so forth, and have connected the dots between, the value that real estate brings in terms of money for local budgets, in terms of jobs, in terms of helping retirees save, or people save for their retirement through their pension investments, or so on and so forth. And that, you know, has and by the way, there's an awful lot of national legislators, and this is going to kill me to say this, but are that, you know, these guys, a lot of them that come from city and state elected offices. And so they're used to, they understand, many more of them than used to, because they were either mayors or on city councils and stuff, and they get it. And, you know, and thank God the private equity world and hedge funds came along and drug dealers came along to boost us up on the appreciation scale. But no, I don't think that we're you know, a picked on industry necessarily. We're big and diverse and largely successful, and so they are going to look at us. Now, Mark's point on inflation and mishandling the interest rates, well, the fact of the matter is that, yeah, a lot of the economy doesn't really care about interest rates. The state and federal spending, they could care less. If you got to get an operation, you don't go, well, geez, what's my interest rate on paying for my heart surgery? If you want education, you know, so a lot of the economy largely was unaffected and is unaffected by interest rates. Real estate and auto dealers, car purchases, so forth, you know, is really, you know, been the victim, I guess, of these high interest rates. Now, everybody can quibble around the edges, and maybe there are misstatements there, but by and large, we bore the brunt. And then you had all this money that was kicked out of Washington that people, you know, went out and spent. And so that's why it's been very difficult, I think, for the Fed to effectively get it within what they want as their target for inflation, because people had all this money to spend. Interest rate going up didn't affect a lot of spending within our society. But I'm not all that pessimistic about it's hard work, and you got to prove it. And by the way, the other thing is that if you look at the makeup of Congress, just, you know, who's up there, I believe that there's only 5 members of the House Ways and Means Committee, Tax Writing Committee, that were there in 2017. So you have all these things coming due, and the people that are going to be reviewing them, it's not like, well, I signed off on this 5 years ago, I must have had my head on straight, so let's just do it again. These people weren't even there. And so they're going to have to be re-educated on every single issue. And again, it will come up either in the context of these expiring these expiring Trump tax cuts, or it will come up in the context of where we're going to get the money to lower our deficit or to reduce our national debt. And again, you got to start combing through the tax law, and you're going to find a boatload of them that apply to real estate. And why do they apply to real estate? Because somebody put them into law. And so I guess they didn't really hate you because they put it in the law. But all of this will be debated, and we just have to have the facts and present them in a rational way that is long term. And I have no doubt that we will largely be successful, but it won't be easy. And again, thank God for hedge funds and others.
That's a good point, Jeff, about
You know, look on TRIA. Let me just say this also on TRIA. Mark, you mentioned TRIA. Now, when there was a cessation of investment and transactions in America in the months following 9/11, it was very, very bad. The chairman of the banking committee in the Senate was from Alabama. He could care less. He kept saying, this is a big city issue. This is no, who cares? Who cares? And then we went in and we showed him that the Alabama Teachers Fund was the biggest investor in Columbus Circle at the time. And he was like, oh my God. And so when you demonstrate, you know, the impact, it's not, you know, and a lot of people don't realize this. And yesterday I was out in Milwaukee at the convention and spoke at lunch, and the CNN person who interviewed me she was like, oh my God, I didn't realize that real estate contributed almost 20% to the GDP. And then she said, oh, geez, that changes my whole point of view on a lot of this stuff. It's very intertwined. And when you break it down, we as an industry have an excellent case to make if we make it in the right way, in the right language, you know, to the right people at the right times. But a lot of that frequently breaks down and you have to like sand off the edges here and there. But I don't feel picked on. I know that I'll tell you what, no way would I want to be representing the pharmaceutical industry or big tech or God, I can name all kinds of industries that I believe Washington hates more than they hate us. And now the most hated, and then I'll shut up. But, you know, the single family rental business, which has expanded, you know, and in my view has helped provide capital to a part of our industry that really needs it. And it's providing opportunities for people who otherwise couldn't live in certain zip codes and get the kind of education that they otherwise could have gotten. They can now rent in part. That is very misunderstood on Capitol Hill. And there's a lot of smoke up there about, you know, the single family rental industry and how terrible these people are. And oh my God, oh my God. And again, we just have to make the case in the right way for why this is a very important part. And it's a small part, but you know, it's only 2% of houses or something like that. It gets overblown. And you know, facts eventually, in my view, matter. And they don't at the start of debates, but hopefully they will at the end.
Thanks. We just have a few more minutes and I would like to get to some questions from the audience, which kind of actually take this back to transactions and investments and real estate sectors. So the first question is about industrial, because we did end up talking a lot about office, and that inevitably these days that's where things go. But this person wants to know if industrial assets will continue to outperform in the current and near future economic environment.
I'll step up and start on that one if you'd like. Our view would be yes. The fundamentals that are driving that sector have been very strong for well over a decade. We think the fundamental drivers are going to remain true going forward. You know, and notwithstanding working through a period here of a little oversupply, but still very solid demand, you know, the sector is poised to be a really solid operating one in our view going forward. And we think it's going to be one of the ones that performs best over time. So we think, you know, that it's still going to be, you know, one of the better places to place capital.
Could not agree more. And this gets right back to the conversation about the painting with a broad brush. The numbers are down somewhat, you know, in the last year for industrial. But if you don't take that into context of values and rental rates kind of doubling for the couple of years before that, it's very hard to make sense of this. You look at the amount of industrial space that has been delivered over the last few years, it's historic. And yet, we're barely reaching 7% vacancy. That's a really, really good stat. It's a really, really great, you know, set of circumstances. So, yeah, could it keep the pace that it was moving at? The same thing for multi-res, but you know, could it keep the pace? No, of course not. Nothing does. But it was white hot. It's rock solid. The fundamental and you know, as Jeb said, the fundamentals of business support it in every way. So, yeah, are you expecting it to double next year? No, but is it rock solid? Yes.
Along those lines, harking back to the conversations we were having when we were planning this session, what about some of the niches that everybody's looking at, like outdoor storage? I mean, is it good to I'm not asking for investment recommendations. I should qualify this, but I'm interested in your perspectives on the growth opportunities in those sectors relative to the broader, you know, warehouse distribution type of property.
Are you asking about what we're all calling iOS in specific, or just kind of the broader array of alternative property types?
Uh, broader.
All right, well, again, I'll chime in quickly here, and others are going to have their own opinions. To us, it boils down to the same thing that we always thought we looked at when we looked at the major property sectors. Where do we think the fundamentals look strong going forward? And that kind of guides us as to where we think we want to invest. And many of the alternative property types we think have, really strong fundamental pictures. Some of them are driven by the same things, that drive other property types. So we would argue that what's driving IOS, outdoor storage, as part of the industrial framework is the same dynamics that are driving industrial. So we have a positive view of that because we think the same thing's driving it. Some of the housing property types that are alternative, we think, are driven by some of the, the really fundamental underlying drivers of all housing, which is a shortage of it. So we think apartments are going to be solid going forward, but we also think manufactured housing and single family rental, are going to be very positive for the same fundamental underlying reasons. Storage, we think, has got a positive outlook, and many of the healthcare sectors long term too.
I was just I agree with all that. I think Mark was going to say something, and I think earlier, and to piggyback on what Mark says, it really matters where, and that broad brush is where I think we get into trouble. And I think earlier Jeff and Mark both said facts. Why are people not paying attention to the facts? Well, because the facts are not sexy, right? And feelings and kind of going with the talking head point of the day, whatever that is, has so much emotion connected to it. So I think if there was one takeaway, it would be drill down on the facts. Make sure that when you're kind of feeling like what you're hearing is quite emotional, then you might not necessarily be connected with the reality and more just some folklore that's being repeated. And so people can get all emotional about the folklore as opposed to like, what are the facts? And if you kind of look historically, I think, Jeff, you made an excellent point about the fact that when you look at this over decades, we're just in a part of a cyclical reality that has remained true for all of our lifetimes. And so just follow where we are in the cycle based on history. And we know that this too shall pass. And depending on where you see we are in the cycle, it's in either opportunity to buy, opportunity to sell, and like look at the markets and see where you are as far as geographically where you're sitting, because it's not all the same asset class and locality. We didn't even get to talk about locations and markets and major markets and cities and submarkets, and like what's right where matters quite a bit. But Suzanne, I don't know if you have any other final. I see we have like 2 minutes.
Yes.
I just want to jump on some, talking about multifamily and housing investment being attractive and everything. Well, the president is now about to unveil or has unveiled a proposal that is extremely damaging, I believe, to being an attractive asset class. And that is this notion of capping rent increases or taking away legitimate depreciation and interest deductions and other things. And it is absolutely counter to the idea of incentivizing more supply of housing and better housing for people. And I hope and I believe that it is purely a political proposal, and I can't imagine it actually getting saluted and making it back to his desk to be signed. But strange things do occasionally happen. But that would be a negative. And then the other thing that I would just throw out there is this kind of xenophobic feeling that is evidence in states, Florida and many other states, about foreign investment in the U.S. and how that could get legs in more states and maybe in Washington. And we have to be careful about those things that would impact the legitimate capital flows that are based on fundamentals, market conditions. So I would just toss that out, and I wanted to say it, so I said it.
Yeah, Suzanne, if I can get just a 15 seconds, and this
Sure.
brings back to kind of everything that we've been saying, facts matter. Emotion needs to come out of this. Outdoor storage, cold storage are doing well. But there's basic economic theory. If everyone plows into those same assets, you will create a problem. These are good assets.
Mhm.
And we just have to be mindful of the data underneath all of this. And again, hopefully, you know, kind of from this that people took away, think through these things, right? You know, because the facts do matter.
Maybe we should just leave it there since we're at the top of the hour, and that's a good, solid final thought. So thank you all for this really insightful conversation. Thanks to our audience for attending today, and we will be sending you all a link when the recording is available. If you enjoyed today's session, we hope you'll be able to join us for the next CPE Voices webinar, as well as our upcoming multifamily discussions. And we do talk in depth about the multifamily side if you haven't heard our MHN Voices and other multi-housing news webinars. So please do join us for those as well. Thanks again to everybody. I really enjoyed our time today.
Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.